Great. So, welcome everybody again to Dome Workshops, How Narratives Fuel the Ways We Fight. So, let's see if this slide will work. Great. So, there's going to be 4 elements of tonight's workshop. So the first, we're going to be talking about some of the ideas involved with narratives and how they work. Then we're going to be talking about some techniques about how to identify them or what we can kind of do about them. Then there's going to be an exercise, and then we're going to have some discussion about that at the end. I know that the last time we had a workshop on this kind of conflict resolution stuff, it went kind of long, especially with the presentation. So I'll try to keep things a little bit shorter this time, so we can make sure everything's finished at around 9 o'clock. Sorry, somebody was sending a message asking for links. Amir, could you send Tess the link?
Sure.
Thanks. I can't. It's a bit hard with my computer. Okay, so story time. The block here kind of covers some of the picture, but what's the story here? Many of us are familiar with it.
Snow White.
Snow White. So who wants to retell Snow White in 10 seconds or less? Or 15? I don't know, just as you will.
Girl eats poison apple, falls asleep. Boy kisses her, she wakes up.
Great. So this is one we've seen a bunch of times in different formats, different cartoons. Great story. But what does this story tell us about the world, about people, and about life? Why do we tell this story? And why is it like something that's told and retold so many times? Anyone can just unmute themselves and comment.
The magical component, you know, the poison and then the kiss to awaken from the deep sleep. That's sort of like a magical component. A lot of people like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's the entertainment component of it, but what does the story tell us?
Oh, I see.
If you're patient and good, you will be saved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some virtues that are being transmitted through it. Absolutely. What else?
I think it speaks to how fragile women are, and that
Mm-hmm.
we need a man to come and save us and kiss us awake to make us better.
Mm-hmm. So there's some virtue action. There's some fragility of women going on. What else? So what's the world of the story like? Sorry, Patty?
Don't look for your man, let him find you.
Okay. So the man is active, the woman is passive. There's a lot of gender action going on here. But what's the world like here? What's
Women are taking care of the domestic aspects, right?
Okay, so there's lots and lots of gender stuff. I feel like we could unpack that for the rest of the 2 hours, but what about
The dwarves are powerless. The animals and the dwarves are powerless to help her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes our friends can be powerless. Also, this kind of goes into magic, right? Like sometimes we need the power of something kind of beyond us as well, right? Like we might not be able to fix our problems by ourselves. Another thing that I think about in this story is that the world is dangerous. Like you can't trust strangers, you know, like somebody who tries to do something good to you, maybe they're actually going to give you a poison apple. It's going to make you fall asleep for forever.
She wasn't really a stranger, though, was she? It was a power imbalance. Or she wasn't really a stranger per se, though, right? It was about a quest for power and control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are powerful people who want to do us harm, maybe. We have to protect ourselves. So yeah, I'm sure we can kind of go on for a number of kind of different things about this, but like stories like this, what they do is that like when we tell them, especially to kids, they also kind of communicate a certain worldview or certain things that we might think that our kids need to know. And that's also kind of why so many fairy tales are being kind of reimagined right now because our values are changing quite quickly as a culture. And so like some fairy tales need to be like updated, and that causes all sorts of grief. So this is one kind of story, and it tells us things about the world. Story time. Again, what's happening here? What's this event?
I guess.
Storming of the Capitol.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other names for this event?
A protest.
A protest?
The world's gone crazy.
World's gone crazy. So so basically what are the different stories told about this event? So we've named some of them just in the name of it. A storming of the Capitol, a protest, people going crazy. So what are some more stories that are told about this? What are some more narratives that are used to describe this event?
Yeah. I was thinking of the insurgence of like infiltration of I can't think of what the group is called, patriots, you know what I mean? Like infiltrators that are stirring things up and causing problems.
So the patriots are causing problems, or people are infiltrating
No,
the patriots?
the infiltrators, the insurgents, the ones that caused the problems and stormed the fences.
Mm-hmm.
Insurrection.
Yeah. Also, for some people, this is a story of patriotism and of people kind of standing up.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other stories told about this? Maybe for some folks who haven't spoken up yet.
My participation is going to be a little low because, sorry, I gave my reason in text chat, so I'm just going to keep quiet.
Yeah, okay, no problem.
Domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Domestic terrorism. So all of these different stories tell us something different about the world. So what we named, I wrote them down. We named about 5 or 6 different ones. So for example, storming, which kind of has this violent turn to it, protest, crazy, insurrection, infiltration, patriotism, terrorism. So what do these particular stories tell us about the world?
One thing that comes to mind is that violence is the means that's necessary to either gain or maintain power.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Somebody's writing in the chat. It's dangerous. The world is dangerous. Yeah. So something can happen like this.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge too that people can have like competing narratives and perceptions of the events that they're witnessing, and they can be interpreting what those events are and what they mean differently. And even thinking leading up to the elections, there was also a lot of divisive rhetoric about the election process and the absentee ballot process and the security of that process. And I think that the rhetoric surrounding that also fueled different narratives about what happened on that date.
Mm-hmm. So this was Sabina speaking?
Yeah, that was me.
So you kind of summarized the point of this whole exercise. There are different interpretations and they're competing and all this stuff. And it's also interesting that you brought up that there were different narratives and stories that were told before this event that led to this event. So it's not, this event wasn't just producing stories, it was a product of stories. One of those stories was, like, what were some of the stories that produced this event?
That mail-in balloting was going to be rigged or criminalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so lots of different stories about like there was something wrong with the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard different variations of that. And the stories were so powerful that it generates action. And I don't want to say anything in terms of like judging like good or bad or anything like that. It's like, this is like, stories are powerful, you know? And when we communicate stories, we're communicating like a vision about the world, and we pass that on. So do these stories tell us about the world? What do these stories leave out? We're talking about competing stories, right? So we looked at protests, crazy people, infiltration, patriotism, terrorism. Are those complete stories, or do they leave certain pieces out? And what would those be? So you could say like this, the terrorism story leaves out blank.
I feel like a lot of the stories and narratives that we've brought up acknowledge like the actors that were at the Capitol on the day and interpretations of what they did. But similar to what we talked about earlier, they seem to leave out of the story the different components that fueled them towards that action. And I think if you're thinking about accountability, it's important to think about like incentives too. So that's one thing that I think was missing from a lot of these stories, is it looked at, I would guess, the that day itself, but not so much, they don't say much about what led to that event.
So it leaves out the why, like, or certain elements of the why. What else might get left out of a story like this?
The individual stories, a lot of them were describing group action.
Yeah, that's a really big one, where we can start talking about entire groups of people as groups. And so individual motivations for being there might be left out, and those might not fit the narrative that's on the news or whatever, or even like one group can be composed of lots of little groups as well, and those stories might get left out. And then what do these stories tell us about the people doing the telling?
I think of the news right away, because on the day that this happened, I had seen video of like the Capitol Police taking the fences down and waving people in. And my friend who lives in another city was watching just the storming of people going into the Capitol building. And so we both were watching scenes from this story, but we both saw different perspectives, and that has colored how we tell our own story about what we saw. So what you see and what you're told, and what is projected in the news. So if only the storming is shown in the news and you're not seeing people invited in to open doors, then it looks like it's a storming. But it was actually invitation on in many parts of the building.
The stories often tell us, the tellers, like the person telling the story, what their conclusion or assessment is of the situation, whether they're using negative language or positive language. So you get the storyteller's opinion about the event.
Yeah, so a lot of these stories aren't neutral, right? Yeah. So in the same way that this event can produce stories and be produced by stories, in the same way it's like people who receive the story, they can be shaped by it. So kids hearing about Snow White might receive certain information about how the world works. But the people who tell Snow White, they're also shaping the story for a point, you know? It doesn't have to, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a manipulative point, like a lot of our education, you know, like a lot of the books we write for kids in a lot of ways, we try to make sure that they're full of certain things. I remember like Magic School Bus, you know, like it's full of lessons, but they're shaped, you know, and they're shaped by somebody. So these stories, there's something in the chat. This picture also spells victory, just from the angle and other properties.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Amir. So these kinds of stories, when we refer to them as narratives, narratives are the kinds of stories that we tell to explain something, to predict something, or to communicate a worldview. So it's not just like with certain stories, there's the entertainment portion, kind of like what Lisa was saying earlier, but narratives are a little bit more than that. So sometimes narratives also do other things too, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to focus on these. And the secret sauce of these narratives are cause and effect. These are stories that are meant to say a certain series of events or lead to a certain conclusion, as Sabina mentioned earlier. So that's also why they're shaped in a certain way. So if we look at one event, two different people or two different groups of people, they're going to assemble a different narrative because they already have something that they want to say about that. So why talk about narratives? Are we just really into stories, or is there something kind of something else here that's also going on? So narratives can fuel conflict, as lots of us know. So in some of our other workshops that we've had, that I've led over the past few months, we've talked about different topics and different techniques. So the double crux one we did a couple months ago, was about how to figure out someone's positions or beliefs in a dispute. We talked about nonviolent communication, or how to be present to a person's emotions and needs in a conflict. Last month, or like a month and a half ago, we talked about the identities and values, why we fight, so what triggers us and what do we fight over. So when we talk about narratives, what does this add to the smorgasbord that we've made here? It's how do the ways we make sense of the world encourage us to clash with each other? Are there some narrative? There's a term, a conflict conducive narrative. Are the stories that we tell and retell within our groups or within our families or within our institutions, are these stories ones that are like conducive to creating conflict with certain people? So we're going to be kind of talking a little bit about that today. So have you ever fought anyone else because of, have you ever been in a fight because of someone's narrative, either yours or someone else's?
Yes.
Maybe an example?
I work in retail, and right now there are various opportunities where people with different narratives about COVID express those narratives in relation to the store's policies of wearing a mask or whatnot, and sometimes it can get loud. So
yeah, so there are stakes to the narratives, especially when we're talking about COVID. The story we tell about COVID will have a lot of impact on how people behave. And there's, yeah, like it can come with a lot of consequences depending on where, on the context we're talking about. Anyone else with an example?
I think the person that causes the most conflict with narratives is me having my narratives. I misinterpret or assume someone is doing something for a particular reason, or they mean it's a particular thing. And instead of being calm and like breaking it down and discussing it and figuring out the truth, yeah, that's the biggest issue for me.
Yeah, so it's definitely something on both sides, or many different sides of that. So it actually leads right into the next slide, which is great. So when we're talking about different types of narratives, there can be narratives about us and about the other. Obviously, they're about groups and things like this, but I put down some narratives that I've heard often. So about us, there could be like, I'm a victim, I'm tolerant, my opinions don't count, I know better. About the other, like they're an aggressor. Like I've lived quite a bit of the past few years in Russia and in Ukraine, and who is or is not the aggressor is a really sensitive topic. But that's also kind of narrative. Or about the other, they are beyond reproach, or they're backward, or they have more right to be here than me. So what are the consequences of these types of narratives?
They're all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They affect our behavior.
Sorry, go ahead.
They affect our behavior. Like, for example, my opinions don't count would lead a person to not stand up for the opinions, or maybe not engage in a conversation if that person has already written themselves off.
Yeah. So what might be a situation where somebody receives a narrative that my opinions don't count?
You shut down. You don't want to share your opinions with that person.
Mhm. Like, I guess I was thinking more like, what kind of system would produce a narrative that tells me my opinions don't count?
Sometimes
what kind of
voters feel that
environment?
way.
Sorry?
I think sometimes voters feel that way. I think that's the
Mm.
biggest reason people don't vote.
Mm. Yeah, and when talking about the Capitol and about Trump and stuff, like there are narratives that saying that, like, you know, some people don't count and they need to start counting, and they need to start counting in a certain way. So it also kind of has some consequences. But yeah, and so I also just kind of wanted to point out here that that it can be easy to think that we use like narratives are used kind of aggressively or against people, but sometimes narratives can be used against ourselves in a way. So it goes also both ways. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think too that it gives us sometimes entering a situation with a preconceived notion or bias that sometimes we can have that self-fulfilling prophecy, like I'm a victim. So even though there's nothing that says that I am in this particular situation, I'm treating it from the get-go that that's the way it is. So everything that happens, that's the way I'm going to interpret it.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is there, like, when we're talking about victim narratives, it can be used like that in a very disempowering way. But some people also use victim narratives as a way to mobilize, saying we've been victimized and now we need to do something about it. And sometimes, like, they form a group saying that something's been done to us and we need to react. You know, we might need to seek justice. And so that there's like these narratives, they can be used in different ways. And Amir says in the chat, narratives fuel justification. Yeah, again, this cause and effect. So if this, then that, or I have a right to this, or I don't have a right to this. So there's lots of that kind of action happening.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about narratives based on assumptions too, and how that can lead to conflict based off of unfounded grounds. So if you have like assumptions regarding who the other is or what they believe, and there's no verification process that's put into place to figure out whether or not those assumptions are true, you can develop conflict based on like a narrative of somebody or like aspects of that other that aren't actually, that are just like unfounded reasoning, or I guess don't really dive into the why. So that's interesting.
I find that CBD that you mentioned that, it made me just think about how that type of thinking often contributes to the need for CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, right? About understanding why you think the way you do and where's the proof.
And another thing that you guys just made me think of too, there can be narratives that also like make it hard to challenge other narratives. Like, for example, if I challenge this thought or if I challenge this belief, that makes me a bad person. And so those are narratives that like kind of shore up these other narratives that that kind of promote these assumptions about other people. And so these are all these different kinds of narratives are, some people call them conflict narratives, some people call them conflict conducive narratives. What are some other ones that you've heard? Narratives that can either lead to conflict or that can kind of lead to demonization or dehumanization of the other. Sharon says, doubting Thomas. What did you mean by that one?
That was from before when you were talking about how there's like things you can't question because if you do, you're wrong.
Yeah. And some people don't want to be that, or they feel like their place in the community also might be threatened by challenging certain beliefs, which is also very complicated. But yeah, anyone else with any other conflict narratives that they've heard kind of thrown around, especially on social media, that breeding place of narratives?
Or fringe thinking, things like that, that I have a different perspective on a lot of things. And so people will minimize or neglect, it's not my word, but you know what I mean, make my opinion less valid than theirs. You know, in discussion, they sort of, I can't think of the word you talked about, but they would
marginalize the opinion?
Marginalize, thank you, that's it.
Like the type of narrative that's like, this is okay thinking and this is like not okay thinking. and then
Yeah.
saying this not okay thinking, maybe it's just misguided, but sometimes it's crazy, sometimes it's unhealthy, sometimes it's deranged. And so all those narratives are certainly conflict conducive narratives. And it's hard because, you know, some of us have very like solid ideas of what we think the truth is, right? And so it's hard to have sometimes like a very concrete belief about something important without marginalizing somebody else's opinion.
Mhm.
I've seen Facebook posts where they're like, if you believe this, this, or this, then unfriend me.
Yeah.
I often think too that sometimes it can be hard to speak to a narrative if it is in conflict with what's perceived to be your identity and the way that people have classified you.
Mhm.
So you're almost scared to speak out because then everything else about you is challenged, right? Because, well, a good example is just I'm very rooted in my Christian faith, but I have a little bit more of an open idea. For example, I'm very open to loving, like you just love everybody. It's not our opinion to judge people. So it doesn't matter, you know, the whole gender identity issue. I'm completely open to everybody, but it's like, well, the Bible says, and if you were really a Christian, you wouldn't support that. Wait a minute, what?
Yeah, and
So-
the flip narrative of that too, that if you believe X, Y, Z about gender, then you are a bigot and homophobic and transphobic and all these other things. So it's sort of like what Sharon said. It's like, if you believe X, then you are a Y. And you're kind of written off that way. Like the whole, if you believe X, then get off my Facebook.
So there could be 100 traits to that classification, but if one of them has an X beside it, it erases the other 99.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That you're identified based on that, your opinion on one matter. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many of you guys were there for the last kind of conflict resolution workshop that I did here, but we were talking about something called social sorting, which is kind of when different identities kind of team up in these big groups. And then it's like the stakes are so high that to challenge one aspect of your identity is like this big humiliating thing. And so people don't want to do that. It sucks. Yeah, so like there's lots of stakes involved. So you guys again predicted the next slide. So what happens when narratives conflict? Stories can be attached to identities, values, worldviews, purpose, and a sense of safety or belonging, especially when they're invested with like a story can be a description of something, but when the story is a narrative, it has all this extra weight behind it. And so when one person comes with one narrative and another person comes with another narrative and they just clash, it's not just our stories are clashing, but maybe our identities are clashing, or our like this idea of safety too is like really interesting. Like there's some people that literally when their narrative is challenged, like their brain chemistry like acts as if they've been like physically threatened. So they close up, they enter this black and white style of thinking. Yeah, there's very high stakes. So people get triggered, basically. And a lot of the work that people do in this kind of conflict resolution or conflict transformation sphere, it's about like all these different techniques. They're just like, how do you de-trigger, how do you de-escalate some kind of conversations that people can like kind of act from their best selves rather than from their triggered selves. So again, we talked about different techniques like double crux and nonviolent communication in some previous presentations. I'm not going to get into that too much now because we're out of time. But I didn't record the first one with double crux, but actually I just found the recording from nonviolent communication, so I can post that a bit later too. But there's lots of great information about that. So with the double crux, it's about how do you engage with somebody's positions and beliefs, and the nonviolent communication is like how do you help a person and process their emotions and needs, especially when they're triggered. So all these different techniques have like they're all different tools in a toolbox, and they're all about how do we get out of the situation that gets triggered and escalated and out of control. And so figure out if a narrative is at play, and if it's triggering something, we can look for different red flags. So and there's lots more red flags, but some ones that if we hear these things, we can start thinking, oh, maybe there's a narrative. So like they're just X, right? So they're just stupid, or they're just right, or they're just wrong. Like there's no justification for it. It's just like something that's taken as true. or how can they believe, feel, or think X? This is also kind of some similar to what some of you guys were talking about in your examples. Another big red flag is just that's how things are. If we ask about something about why, and if we kind of come up against this kind of response, sometimes it means that there's a narrative in play, there's a certain worldview. And maybe that worldview is accurate, but maybe that worldview doesn't take into account some other facts or some other aspects of that. And so when we're trying to, like, when somebody is triggered, and if we notice that, we can start thinking, oh, maybe like I stepped on a narrative, or oh, maybe they stepped on my narrative, and then this is starting to escalate. So we're kind of talking about, you know, this is how things can be sometimes. What can we do about that? So when we think a narrative is at play, we can do a couple different things. So for example, you can try to center yourself. So there's a lot of kind of mindfulness work that people try to do when they're just kind of triggered and stuff. And the nonviolent communication work is a lot about this. How do you listen to yourself, make yourself feel seen, make yourself feel heard, so that you can kind of have extra resources to deal with the situation that's at hand. Trying to de-escalate the situation. This is connected to the frame things collaboratively. So like, how do you stop, like one, how do you identify the trigger, and how do you like stop triggering the person at that moment, and how do you collaboratively try to step back from things? And so there's lots of techniques that are kind of about that de-escalation. We've talked about them in previous workshops. We're not going to get too much into them today. What I wanted to talk about more is something called a bucket error. And this is something that's actually quite, it's a technique and tool that's tied to narratives in particular. So actually first, are there any other thoughts about things that we can do if we think we've stepped on a narrative landmine that can help us de-escalate a situation?
I think that when I do it, I'm really what's going on is I'm entitled. I think like, how dare they do that? How dare they think that? How dare? But maybe I'm different than other people. I don't know. But I realize it's like a bit of entitlement and fear.
And for, I don't know, from your experience, how can we engage in it? Like, what can we do when we feel like that?
I have to step back and see what I'm assuming and see what narrative I'm telling myself that's making me feel like, how dare they? One is that no one should be doing anything against me, that I'm like, anyway, you have to think about what you're thinking about and how you're framing it in your mind. For me, I'm probably more entitled than most people. I don't know.
I like what you said about stepping back, because sometimes it's like, sometimes when we're triggered, it's just like impossible, you know, like in that moment to kind of like treat the other person charitably, or to kind of look at things like with multiple dimensions. Sometimes you really just need to like separate yourself from like the situation, and like not just like take a few breaths and, you know, do some breathing work. For some people that works and that's great, but for some of us, we just have to like, if something is triggering us or feels threatening, we need to like step back from that and then kind of like re-engage. So like one of my roommates, she's gearing up for an election campaign, and so lots of people are emailing her all sorts of triggering emails, and she like her trick is to send the emails to us first, so we can look at them and like discuss them, and that prevents her from like responding right away. So different people have different tricks about that. Yeah, anyone else, any thoughts on this?
I was thinking about how far apart are we in discussion points, and would there be any benefit of continuing, because is there anything that can be gained at that time for pursuing, you know, whatever the topic or item is? So it might not be worth it for your relationship. But in another social or business context, it might be worth it. So you sort of have to, you know, think social context and purpose, and what you hope the outcome to be.
Yeah, similarly to that, or maybe one aspect of it would be to remember, what is my goal in this conversation? Am I trying to convince the person of something? or are we just hanging out? Do I need to convince them on this point? Do I sense some sort of hurt either on my side or their side? And then should I focus instead on that and take the conversation in a different direction based on what was revealed, right? So just to step back and think about like, what is the purpose of us talking right now? And then go in that direction instead of just bulldozing through because we're already on that path, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then a second point, one technique that I sometimes do when I'm getting worked up is to remind myself that I am safe. That sort of like what you said earlier, that physiologically in our brains can act like we're being attacked physically. So to remind myself, I'm not in a life or death situation, actually, like I am safe. I'm not being attacked by a bear, right?
Mhm.
And that often helps bring me down to a more
Mhm.
Less fight or flight mode,
Mhm.
more regulated.
Yeah, like creating like a safe space for like ourselves is like super interesting. And like what some people are able to do, especially when they're like in a space that normally triggers them. Like for me, one thing I've kind of been grappling with lately is so there sometimes I have like my facilitator hat on, so like I don't know, like a kitchen talks or like other things, and when I have my hat on, like, and I'm in that role, like I don't get triggered so much, like I'm just in a different kind of space. But like when I'm having a conversation with my roommates, I like get furious, you know, and it's like I don't like, not only do I get triggered, but I let myself get triggered because I like, you know, I'm allowed, I'm human, all that stuff. I don't have to wear my hat all the time. But yeah, like just framing the context of what are you here for can really do a lot. And there's I was reading actually about this one technique that some people use, like especially when they have like a facilitation circle with like restorative justice or with people who are in disputes. Like sometimes one thing they do is they imagine, like if it's in a company, they imagine the people they're supposed to serve in the company. So like if they're working with kids, or if it's like at a school, they imagine like a circle of the children around them as like a way to remind them to like stay on task, right? And so that like there's something bigger than the things that are triggering them. Sabine also said in the chat, self-awareness, figuring out what people truly mean by what they say, why they believe what they believe, what underlying needs they may have. Yes, absolutely agree. And another thing actually, also, like we're talking about a lot of high level stuff, like reminding ourselves about things. Sometimes we just need to eat and sleep, you know, like there are like times when I know that like there's gonna be like a hard conversation and like I really want to like nap before and just like not be coming in already feeling like crap. So we're human. So yeah, these are all different things we can do, but I wanted to talk about one specific kind of technique and framework called the bucket error. And then after that, we'll kind of go into an activity. I really like this one. It was designed by a group called the Center for Applied Rationality, CFAR. Some of you guys have heard about it. Oh, Sharon also said in the chat, halt, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. If you're any of these things, I guess you're supposed to halt. It's a great acronym. I'm going to use it somewhere. I will cite you or not cite you. I'm sorry. So to talk about bucket errors, first I want to talk about a story. So there's a little girl. She's in school. What's her name? I don't know. Her name is Sophie. And Sophie wants to be a writer. And she writes this beautiful little short story. And it's about a little girl who goes to the ocean and the ocean talks to her or something sweet. I don't know. So she hands in her story and the teacher said, like Mark said, and gets back to her and says, wow, this is great. But there's just one mistake. You spelled ocean wrong. She spelled ocean, O-S-H-U-N. And the girl said, no, I didn't. No, I didn't write it wrong. And the teacher said, well, you know, it's okay, you know, but you just wrote this letter wrong. And the girl again said no, and the teacher like opened up the page and showed her literally what it was. And the girl said, no, I can be a good writer, and runs away crying. What happened there? So CFAR, this group that I learned this from, they call this a bucket error, because for kind of this little picture here, they think that if we kind of name a bunch of different questions that are above, is ocean spelled correctly? Am I allowed to pursue writing? Will I ultimately succeed as a writer? These are all kind of like raindrops, right? And they're all going in the same bucket. And that bucket only has one label, yes or no. So whatever the answer to the ocean question is, that's the answer to all the other questions because they're linked together in her mind. So is ocean spelled correctly? If there's the bucket error happening, if the answer is no, then for her, that also means I'm not allowed to pursue writing and I will not ultimately succeed as a writer. Narratives can funnel different questions into one bucket. As we've kind of talked about earlier, the secret sauce of the narrative is cause and effect. So in lots of different situations, people all have lots of different questions that seem to us on the outside that they're completely separate, but for whatever reason, they're all being funneled into one bucket with one answer. So when we're talking with somebody and it seems like there's something irrational, there's something that doesn't compute, sometimes what's actually happening is a bucket error. And then we need to ask questions to figure out, oh, is there actually other questions that are attached to these questions? What are they? Can I try to separate them? So I think there's another picture here. Yeah, so it's like, how can we help try to work with this person to separate these different questions into different buckets that allow for the person to, for example, Sophie, for her to look at, is ocean spelled correctly, and not for when all the questions are like linked into one bucket, it's not a safe question because it's attached to so many other really important things. So how do we create a safe space for somebody to answer a single question? So this is what the bucket error framework is. There are, Marriott says bad connection, will rejoin. There were 2 instances recently where I kind of encountered a bucket error and I just wanted to share them. So first I was talking with a friend and for her, hearing the different, so in Canada, we had a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the Indigenous peoples. It ended a number of years ago. And one of the recommendations that came out of it is that people recognize that we're on unceded territory of a particular Indigenous tribe. So in Ottawa, we would be on the unceded territory of the Algonquin tribe, or people, sorry. And so for her, for my friend, it's very difficult for her to hear this because for her, if like, let's go back. Can we go back with the slide? I don't think so. No, it's not working. We're just gonna stay here. Yeah, so it's like, is this unceded territory is connected to the question, do I not have a right to be here? So for her to hear, like, yes, we are on unceded territory means that she doesn't belong. And so for her, it's difficult to even think about that. Another one with another friend I was speaking to, we both grew up within a religious Catholic context. And so there's a lot of conversations about the abuse scandals, the sex abuse scandals with the priests that have been uncovered again and again, numerous times over the past 2 years. And for some Catholics, it's really hard to talk about them because the questions that are linked are the priests, or did the church collude with these abuse scandals? And is the whole thing bullshit? So those 2 questions are together. And so for some people, it's really hard for them to admit to the abuse because for them, it's tied up to, is this bullshit? So again, how do we detach those buckets? How do we interrogate those narratives? These unspoken narratives that can get very triggering very quickly. Bucket errors. When we're talking about what happened at the Capitol in January, there are a lot of people with a lot of different bucket errors. If I support this, that means I am this. If I'm against this, that means that I am this. So this, if this, then that kind of formula we've been talking about, these are all different kinds of bucket errors. Oh, I can go back. Lovely, now I've figured it out. So yeah, have you guys ever seen kind of bucket errors like this? Or have you kind of experienced something like that? And does this make sense? Are there any questions actually? I don't know, I just kind of spoke for a little bit, and if we have to go back and clarify something, I don't see your faces if you're nodding.
I think like in line with the example that you gave, like if the sex scandals and the whole thing being bullshit are connected, instead of not believing it, but then also leaving your religion.
Yeah, that's
Because-
the other way. Yeah. So that bucket error can make somebody leave or like a faith tradition that might otherwise mean a lot to them, and that might be a very painful experience. And I think with religion, there's a lot of like stories are a big part of religion, and value systems are big parts of religions. And so I think a lot of this stuff can really get activated in that context. Other thoughts?
I was thinking about, oh, sorry, maybe I should put my hand up first, sorry.
No, I can't see you. So
Sorry, I didn't realize that. Okay, it's Patty. I was just thinking about people with complex medical situations and how some doctors will create a narrative in their mind that, oh, this person's a complainer, or this person is a malingerer, or whatever it is, and yet doesn't pursue certain testing or referral to certain doctors. This is close to me family member had been misdiagnosed by many doctors, and each of them had their own narrative from their perspective, from their medical perspective, and the solution was right in front of their eyes, but no one could release this perspective that she had it all in her head, and it was actually a medical mismanagement. And so that was how I was thinking about it, is they couldn't ask a different question that could answer her query, like why was she seeking more information, or a better diagnosis or a different diagnosis. Each of them had a different diagnosis depending on their perspective of her medical condition. But anyway, so that's how I thought of the bucket errors.
Yeah.
If you only come from a certain kind of training or perspective, and all you look at is this part, you don't look at this part and this part and this part. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gesturing with my hands. You only see part of the narrative. You don't see the whole picture, and that was to me like really eye-opening, that you always assume that doctors are sharing information and that doctors are collaborating, but our system often isn't multidisciplinary. It's quite working in isolation. So that was the one that I thought of. I don't know if it's out of context from what you're talking about, but
no, we should bring in different context. I think one also kind of maybe a common bucket error in the medical context might be like, is this person a complainer or a lingerer, and should I ignore them and go on to somebody else? Like that can also be a very connected thing. And that from that comes a narrative that like people who help themselves are more worthy, right? Or people who we perceive, you know what I mean? And like if some, like all those narratives can be bound up in that too.
Yeah.
Sorry, Josh, I
yep.
don't mean to, well, I am interrupting, but there is a way that you can see us while you're sharing. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but if you go up to the top, where we would normally see that we're viewing your screen, you have a little drop box as well. And it's about halfway down that has your ability to see the view window. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's about halfway down.
Yep, I've expanded it now and I can see you guys, but sometimes as I flip the slides, because sometimes there's a lot of words, I have to kind of shorten it and stuff like that. So, so just in case, shout.
I'm wondering if like trauma is also this bucket idea. Like if you have abuse as a child, you probably think you're worthless and it's your fault. And there's all these other things that get thrown into the bucket that maybe don't belong. I don't know.
And like then I know somebody mentioned CBT, but then like there might have to be a lot of work that has to be done to untangle those different trains, you know? And that's like, so within conflict studies, like what I'm studying, like there's some like this kind of cultural stuff that a lot of us are kind of submerged in. But then like when people are actually kind of like victims of violence, or like large scale kind of repression, like it's not so simple kind of, let's just separate, you know, like one bucket from the other bucket. Like for some people, their whole world is like kind of held together in that way. And maybe that's also how they feel secure. Like this is the way they understand the world. And to let go of that means opening up to uncertainty. And if somebody has suffered, maybe even a faulty sense of security might be like better than nothing. But I don't want to speak for anybody, but that's something that kind of comes up in conversation sometimes. So I want to keep going. There'll be a bit more time to discuss a little bit later. We just have to get through one more thing and then we can do the activity. So there's something that's, there's like a conflict conducive narrative, and there's also something that's is called a superior story. And I just noticed that I was rushing to finish this slideshow, so I was copying a lot of these slides, and to look for red flags that shouldn't be there. So, you know, there might be some blips. Oh no, this is, there we go, sorry. That was draft. So building a superior story is, because when we get narratives, a narrative isn't necessarily untrue, right? Like we can have a narrative about something that's true and we still can be biased and we still can be blind to like other facts, but it still might be about something true. So I don't want to like discount like, oh, everything is a narrative and nothing is true. But we can build what's called a superior story, which is a narrative that takes into account multiple sources of data. So when we're confronted with somebody with a different narrative, they're triggering us, we're triggering them. Maybe there's a bucket error that we stumbled onto, maybe our bucket error or somebody else's. What are some things that we can do to help build a superior story together? The first is to create a sense of safety. Again, because when a story is challenged, sometimes it challenges all sorts of stuff inside us. So, and that sense of safety, it's not just, I need to create a sense of safety for the other person, but maybe for me too. Maybe I'm the one who's threatened, and maybe I'm the one that needs my hand held, right? So it's not only about the other person. So safety can be for both or for all. Initiating collaboration can be really powerful with like, okay, so we have this issue, how can we work on this together? Another good trick for creating a sense of safety, if the situation allows it, is admitting how something's affected you. Saying like, wow, we're having this crazy conversation about COVID and like, I don't know how I feel. And I just want to be your friend. How can we do this? You know, like something like that. It's not about our thoughts, our ideas, our ideologies, our narratives. It's about, wow, we're stuck in this and I'm a person stuck in this and you're a person stuck in this. Can we please try to do something together? I want to keep you, you know? If we do, sometimes the person's an asshole and we're just like, get out of my face. And that's okay too, sometimes, depending on the context. But and sometimes we don't want to admit how something has affected us because we can be manipulated or we feel vulnerable. So, you know, be aware of what you need. But if you want to build a superior story with somebody, starting with sense of safety can be really helpful. Getting more data to fill in your story, especially if you're trying to do this and the other person might not know how. Sometimes it's you who has to ask a lot of these questions, but if you can both do it together, then that's great. So checking for bucket errors, like asking questions like, what's at stake here? What does it mean that X means Y? Because you're searching for the other questions that are attached to the first question. Another really important question is what happens next? So I was camping with some friends the other weekend, and there was this one guy, he's very he identifies as a bit more right wing. He's very suspicious of socialism and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, I thought it was a little bit overblown, but then it's like, oh, actually, so what if this thing happens that you don't want to happen, what happens next? And then he says, oh, if this doesn't happen, then this bad thing happens. And then it's about him. He thinks these bad things are going to happen. Okay, so now we can talk about those things that are going to happen that you think. Those are attached to your fears, your needs, your values, all that stuff. So it's about data. It's not just about whether we have healthcare or not. It's about what happens if this happens. So this is another really good way to get data. Then it's confirming your data. So repeating back to the other until they confirm that you've understood how they feel or see the world. And this is very, very similar to nonviolent communication, active listening, things like this. So when we receive this new data, we need to put it together in a way that resonates with us and with them. And that's the stage of building and testing a new story. So you can try to tell a story that includes these different sides and then ask, does this resonate with you? And they say, yes, but there's still this. And then you're collecting data again, finding out more until you say, okay, here's this new story. Does this resonate? And if you're at a point where it resonates with you and if it resonates with them, this is already closer to a superior story. And this can already create a space where people feel seen and heard and dialogue can happen. Any questions about this or any thoughts? This is obviously also like a really hard process. It's not like a ABC kind of thing, but these are just, these are steps that we can take and that we can practice. And if we're triggered, it can be really hard to do this kind of thing. And so sometimes a lot of this is also making sure that we feel safe enough and de-triggered. And that's a whole other set of techniques, but sorry, comments or questions?
It's very hopeful. After talking a lot about negative stuff,
Yeah.
I knew you were going to lead to something we can do, but it's a relief to hear it.
Does this seem too optimistic? Does it seem realistic?
That's where I'm hesitating.
Mm-hmm. So what are some barriers to doing this? What makes this hard?
One question that I have personally is, I feel like oftentimes the way people operate is they make observations of the world around them and then they draw conclusions based off their observations. And I mean, that's also, you know, how you write papers and other things. So for me, thinking about how do you recognize when you're leading into bucket errors, I think could be really complicated sometimes. Like, how do you recognize that the conclusion you're drawing based off of the observations you've made is not like a sound conclusion? Because at least the way that I'm understanding bucket errors, it's this idea of like you question one thing and maybe, or you receive some sort of information and then you develop other questions or conclusions based off of that. But like, what's a rational conclusion, and how do you define like whether something, how rational a conclusion is? I think, I guess it's difficult to figure out where to draw that line, but I certainly think with like this last slide, what you said with getting more data is going to be helpful, right? Like the more context that you have, the more information you have, the better equipped you're going to be to making a sound conclusion. But I definitely think that's one difficulty or one question that I have.
Yeah. It's interesting kind of going back to this idea of rationality. It's very easy sometimes to demonize somebody as like irrational, especially if they're kind of like tripping over some kind of cognitive like blip, you know? And that can also feel really delegitimizing sometimes. There's this interesting group like the CFAR group that actually developed the bucket error technique or framework. They actually offer like they've developed all sorts of different techniques, and they offer like a weekend retreat, and it's like about like rationality optimization, and like that's where I also took the double crux part. Like they're very good at different things, but and there's the Tess who sometimes comes to these events. She heads up the Rationality Ottawa group, and they're kind of a branch of that. But sometimes, yeah, this talk of rationality and irrationality can sometimes be pretty, marginalizing. And that's not actually to say anything about what you were saying, Sabina. That's more kind of like another thing to be taken into account. Yeah.
I have a thought with respect to what Sabina said. One way that I identify bucket errors in myself is with proportionality or with absolutes. So if I'm reaching absolute conclusions, then it's often tied to subconscious bucket errors, like starting with one thing, but then ending up with, therefore I'm horrible, or therefore this is worthless, like these sort of write-off sentences that are very generalized. That's often connected to many other questions along the way, sort of like the example with Sophie, that it's just one question about one word, but she ends up giving up on a career.
Yeah, and it's funny how little some of these things are.
Exactly.
You know, that like lead to existential crises.
Exactly. So that sort of proportionality of like, is my emotional response really, really strong for something that's actually a small event or a small statement? And if that's the case, then there are often it's often a bucket error. There are often many, many questions that I've concluded based on the conclusion to one piece.
Thank you.
I have one other comment. It's I think time is a luxury when it comes to these things. Like you don't always get the ability to like just entertain someone's like logical conclusions. Like if you get into a car crash, you're not going to be like, oh, you don't want to like pay the fine or pay the insurance because you care about your kids. And it's like, you might not be able to put that money towards like your kids' tuition fund or something. And so that's why you're angry. You don't have the time to just like get down to their emotional conclusions. And so in those like high stakes situations, like you're in a car accident and you had to figure out, call insurance companies and do all that jazz, both parties are usually pretty emotional, or one party is emotional, one isn't, and it just creates like a sort of power dynamic. And so I find, I guess my one issue with this is it's predicated on just like almost unlimited time, where you're just like, yeah, you can have a sit down with a person and like just drink some wine for 3 hours and talk about your feelings. But it's like, I don't know if you always have that luxury. And it's like, that's the part that makes this like an art, right? Like, how can you bridge that gap?
And following up on that, like one of the reasons I kind of got like into this kind of stuff was because I was hitchhiking, and all I would do every day is I would sit down and have conversations, and it was like similar conversations. It was like every day, and it was just practice, and that's not something that like, that was a very particular time in my life that like I couldn't just allow myself that now, and so there's within like the community of like mediators and facilitators and like all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of like, there's a new thing people are talking about with like the privilege of like not being triggered, or the privilege of having the time to process this stuff. And especially like if they're working in context of like war or extreme poverty or like gang violence, like not only does not everybody have the time and the resources for this, but some people might be traumatized or like this is all they live. And so like picking a different path is a lot more difficult for them than it might be for somebody who can chill out and watch.
Well, it sort of reminds me of like the argument for rehabilitatory justice system. It's like, oh, we should rehabilitate people, but it's like, it's kind of like easy for you to say, because unless it's really easy for someone to have that opinion without having been victim of something that would cause that, right? So like, if someone committed like a heinous crime against me or my family, I'd be much less for rehabilitatory, letting that person free, because it feels unjust. But it's really easy for me to be like pie in the sky, just like, oh yeah, economically speaking, humanitarianly speaking, like super kind of carte blanche, eagle eye view. Like I can totally see myself having that opinion from like an objective point of view. But then if it happens to me, like, totally different situation. So that it sort of plays into that like practical, realistic aspect versus like the almost rational, rational objective aspect. Like I think it's just like there's an element of realism, like time and emotions versus, just like time and emotions really just wedge a lot of these, and bridging the gap between time and emotions is I think the difference between a good mediator and not.
And I think also another thing is sometimes you have like the time, sometimes you have the ability, but sometimes you just don't want to expend the energy. You're just like,
and neither do they, right?
Like
they'd have to entertain your want to empathize, and if they don't want to entertain that want, then you're just you in a way have to breach, like you have to peel their onion in a way, and some people don't want to get their onions peeled.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
So
Yeah. Some people don't want to get their onions peeled.
Yeah.
Can I quote you on that? I love it.
Go for it.
I'm stealing that. But that's it. Like when I have my facilitator hat on, it's very easily. But when it's my roommates, I'm like, I don't want to scrounge through onions. Like I want to, I don't know, like play Portal or something. Like I don't know, but So yeah, so like when we're talking about these techniques, like all the different techniques we've talked about, all these different frameworks, they all come up with the same barrier, you know, like, and this is just part of that. It's just part of the way it works.
Right.
And so unfortunately, we don't have time in a 2-hour slot to practice as much time so it becomes more natural, but we will have time to practice once.
Uh-huh.
Oh, actually, again, you guys predicted the next slide. What if it doesn't work? Or what if this,
Okay.
this? So we just talked about all that. Lovely. You guys are on the ball today. Or you all just looked at my slides beforehand, which is impossible because they were finished 5 minutes before we started.
We'll stick with the first narrative that you have there,
Yeah.
Josh.
Lovely. Pick your narratives. So time for an activity. So we're going to practice something. What's an event or issue that's been polarizing for many people in this room, for which we've heard lots of narratives?
Yeah. Oh,
So we
Patty,
can suggest different ones.
for me, recently it was the vaccine masking, meeting family kind of thing.
Vaccine masking and which, sorry?
Meeting with family or meeting people outside, like increasing your bubble.
So the issue, so like the how could we phrase this? So like the process of opening up and what that means and what we should do. Okay, that's one.
Well said, well said.
What are some other issues that have been polarizing?
Continued online teaching.
I feel like it's a very polarizing issue for a part of
Small
our
group of people, yeah.
audience. Or is the process of opening up good enough? Like we just need to pick kind of one topic that like everybody has heard different narratives about, and then we're going to do an exercise with that. Is that good enough, or does the process of opening up with the virus, with COVID, or does that not resonate with some people?
I think that resonates for a decent amount. I think that literally impacts everybody, although not everybody is part of the same geographical region. So I guess we just have to be cognizant of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who would not like to talk about this issue? You could also private message me in the chat, so if you don't want to say it out loud. If not, okay. So in the interest of time, we're going to talk about the process of opening up. So we're going to have a Google Doc. Some of you guys have seen, oh, that's a lovely dog, Sharon.
I was just
Sorry.
noticing too. Yeah.
So some of you guys have seen this Google Doc that I'll send. We've used it in some Kitchen Talks activities. So we're going to write different narratives in the doc. If some people write some similar narratives, we'll like put them, we'll kind of combine them and put them so there's kind of a tidy list of different narratives that we've heard about this. And then we're going to have our names in the other column. And as we go down, we're going to write down from a number of 1 to 5 how much we support that narrative. Like 5 is like, yes, this is like true. 1 is like, it's bullshit. And then like everything else in between is like, I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll send the document in. Nice to see you guys. This is lovely. Let me just find. So actually, I'll send you. I'll show you first. I'll share a screen of an example that we had from the last Kitchen Talks. It was about Israel Palestine. So Andrea had already seen this. I won't tell you which answers were hers. It's all anonymous. So this is what the document will look like. So something like this. So we had a number of different narratives on the left. And then up top here, where these letters are, they'll have different people's names. And once we have our list of narratives, we'll go through and we will rank them in different ways. So 5 is like, this is true, and like 1 is not. So actually, a lot of the people who were there the other night had very similar narratives, but we'll see how it is with this. So I'm going to send you this sheet, which is blank. So I'm going to stop scrolling. Does anybody have any questions about this activity? Or are the instructions clear?
Just I often don't go on one end of the extreme. So what if I don't have an opinion? Would that just be 3 on the one?
Yeah. 3 could be indifferent, or you could put 0 if you like absolutely do not care.
Okay.
Yeah, 0 is completely indifferent. 3 is like maybe yes, maybe no. 0 is indifferent.
Okay.
So you guys have the link in the chat. Let me know if you can open it. Great. So first, what are the different narratives that we hear about the about opening up and what we could be doing? Let me just, I'll share the screen again, and we can say different narratives, and I'll write them down just so we're not all in one place. Maybe that would work better.
Okay.
So yeah, so what are some narratives that that we've heard? Or if you find like a spot that's like empty like this down here, feel free to write something if it's quicker. I don't know. We'll figure it out somehow. So what are some narratives about opening up? What do we hear?
We'll have to keep masking, even if you've got 2 vaccine shots. Well, that's the word, yeah, double vax.
I guess there's an expectation there'll be less domestic abuse.
Oh, wow.
What was that, Sharon?
I guess there's an expectation there'll be less domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm. Great, people are. So someone says we're losing freedoms and privileges. We clarify. Also, some people are accidentally writing over each other. So if you can try to pick something that's kind of down here, just in case, and then we can kind of put them back up. We will losing freedoms and privileges. Maybe the person can clarify, like, what will we lose? Like, are we losing privileges by opening up? Like, will we lose more later?
Oh, I'm not saying that's true. It's just a narrative that you hear. It's
yeah,
just
absolutely. Like
yeah,
nobody's. I don't want to connect anything to anybody right now. But
yeah,
so what was?
It's like, for instance, just any sort of restriction on your rights. So like you will get fined if you do X or Y or Z that you didn't have the privilege to do before. So it's like you can't go to a gym, for instance. That's a privilege. Freedom and privilege that people had before, the right to pay for and go to a gym membership. But obviously for public utility, there's a reason why, but I mean, I'm just saying that's the narrative.
Yeah. So does this, I rephrase it, we're still deprived of freedoms and privileges. Does that kind of resonate with what you were thinking about?
We're still deprived?
Because it's like, as things are opening up, like what are the narratives we hear as we're opening up?
Oh, this is as we're opening up. This is on the predicate that this is like, oh, as we're opening up. Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose, yeah, sure. Although I don't hear that as frequently.
So is there anything else that people have been hearing? So they were less than 2 weeks. It's too soon. Just 2 more weeks. Just 2 more weeks. I feel like this isn't a narrative so much as because remember, narratives are things that communicate something, right? That communicate a worldview, that communicate a set of values. So I would probably delete that. But it's a very lovely sentiment. I'm very excited for stage 3. So like, yeah, like for example, like it's too soon, that communicates a certain opinion about the process, right? There will be less domestic abuse contains opinions in it. Anti-vaxxers are going to push us into another wave. That's an opinion. There will be a mask mandate for flu season. Put that up here.
Things will return to normal once there's herd immunity.
I will also add things will return to normal, question mark, like exclamation mark. It's all going to be fixed. Okay, so just give us, like, if you're writing something right now, just take a few seconds to finish, and then I think this is a good list. So now what we are going to do is we're going to write names. So for example, Josh. but I'm not going to participate because I'm presenting. So feel free to write your names across the top here. If you want to remain anonymous, you can write whatever animal you are, like anonymous hippo or liger. There's an anonymous liger in our group.